Welcome to Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean. Today, we are on location in Alameda, California. What we're going to show you how to do today is how to check your valve clearance, also known as valve lash. The reason why we're doing this in Alameda is this is where my buddy Way lives, and we're going to be doing this on his third generation Toyota 4Runner with the 3.4 liter 5VZ-FE engine. The reason why I didn't have Way come to my house in San Jose and film it there is because when we do the valve clearance or valve lash check and we find that we need to make an adjustment and we need to get a shim to change the value and bring it back into the spec we want, we're going to have to order that shim either from Toyota or another supplier. I talked to Stevens Creek Toyota and they say it takes 3 to 5 days to get those shims into their dealership. I could also get them from Nick at Yoda One Performance in Riverbank, California, and that's probably where we're going to buy them from if we need them, because Nick says he can get them sent to us in 1 day, which is preferable than potentially 5 days. If we do have to make an adjustment, we didn't want to have Way stuck at my house waiting for those shims to come in, so it's better that his rig is stuck here at his house where he lives rather than stuck in San Jose at my house. So that's why we're shooting this video in Alameda. We're choosing not to show the teardown of the engine to get the valve covers off, and we're gonna choose not to show getting everything back on the engine because we already show that in different videos. If you click on the links above, we're gonna provide a link to our valve cover gasket video, which is gonna show all the things you need to do a valve cover gasket job. And the reason why we're going to provide that is because this is the opportune time to do your valve cover gasket job when you have the valve covers off to check your valve clearance. To get everything torn apart and put back together, we're going to link our misfire diagnosis and fuel injector replacement video, because that video shows all the steps necessary to get the upper part of the engine torn down to the valve covers and then getting everything put back onto the engine with all the proper torque specs and all the necessary steps to get it done. So that's what we're gonna do. We're trying to save time for this video and not reinventing the wheel, showing all these necessary steps to get down to the valve covers and get the valve covers off, because we show them in those other videos that you can reference if you need those videos in order to learn how to get everything torn down and get everything back together on your engine properly. We're gonna get the upper end of the engine torn apart, valve covers off, and that's where we're gonna return and show you the steps to checking your valve clearances and then how you would go about adjusting it if you found one of your intake or exhaust valves was out of spec. We've got the valve covers off. One trick that we didn't show in the valve cover gasket replacement video is this driver's side harness makes it hard to get the driver's side valve cover out. And there's one thing that I wanted to talk about is there's a bracket that attaches to this part of the wiring harness, and it attaches to one of the nuts that holds on the water neck that houses the thermostat. And if you remove that one nut and then slide the metal bracket off, then you get a little bit more movement. Another area that you want to disconnect is this tab right here, and it hooks on to that tab. And then finally, you have another tab that hooks the wiring harness right here. If you free it from all three of those locations, you can see how much movement we get. And then this way, you have a much easier time sneaking that valve cover out in this direction towards the passenger side. So I wanted to share that one little tip because we didn't share that in the actual valve cover gasket replacement video. We're ready to start checking the valve clearance or valve lash. One additional thing to help us find top dead center, because that's going to be the setting we want the engine in to check our first set of intake and exhaust valves. What we did to help us is we removed the 6 bolts that hold this cover to the engine, and we loosened this clamp and slid it back on the upper radiator hose so we can slide this backwards and we can take a look at the cam pulleys to see where the notches line up. So we want the notches up at the 12 o'clock position and lined up with the timing mark on this cover behind it. Because for every 1 revolution of the crankshaft, the cam pulleys rotate a half a turn. So when you line up the notch on the harmonic balancer with the 0 on the timing tag, right where my finger is pointing, that's not a guarantee that you're at top dead center. You might be or you might not be. So you turn it to where the notch lines up with the 0, and then you check the cam pulleys. If you see the notch lined up to the top at the 12 o'clock position, that means you are at top dead center for the number 1 cylinder. If you don't see the notch, that means you have to turn the harmonic balancer another 360 degrees, get the timing mark lined up with the 0 on the timing tag, and then you should see that the timing marks on the cam pulleys should be up at the 12 o'clock position, letting you know that you're at top dead center compression for the number 1 cylinder. Way has a long 1/2-inch drive ratchet from Gear Wrench. It's a flex head with a short 19mm socket, and he's going to slide that in front of the fan, and he's going to get onto that 19mm crank bolt so we can turn the crank clockwise as you're looking at it from the front of the engine. You want to be turning the engine clockwise, not counterclockwise. If you've never checked the timing on your 3.4 liter engine, let me show you where that notch is on the harmonic balancer. It's closest to the engine. I'm going to come in here from the driver's side and show you. We used a little whiteout to make the notch a little bit more identifiable, and then when you look over to the right, you're going to see that plastic timing tag, and you line up the notch with the 0, and then you go up above and check your cam pulleys to see if the timing marks are at the 12 o'clock position. We went ahead and marked those timing marks with a red paint pen, and I do see that that's at the 12 o'clock position. So we do have the engine in the right position to check the first set of intake valves and exhaust valves. One other thing I wanted to cover, in case you didn't want to deal with taking the upper timing cover off to verify top dead center, on the backs of both cam gears, you can get in here and you can look behind, and there's a couple dots, and you can see that the manufacturer put a couple paint marks on there too, and when those are lined up, that also tells you that you're at top dead center. The same goes for the one on the passenger side. These are the camshafts on the driver's side, and it's a little hard because it's on the back side, so you have to jump up basically on the fender and look in there and see the dots lining up. So that's an alternative way you can confirm you have the engine at top dead center for the number 1 cylinder. We're in my 2000 3rd Gen 4Runner factory service manual, and we're in the engine mechanical on page 4, and this is covering the valve clearance. And again, it tells you to set the number 1 cylinder to top dead center compression. We've done that, and it shows you the little pictogram of how to do that. And it also covers getting the dots lined up on the cam gears, which we just talked about. When you're at top dead center compression for the number 1 cylinder, here's the valves we can check. This is the front of the motor, and they say right hand exhaust, so the exhaust cams are on the outsides closest to the fenders, and then both intake cams are on the inside closest to the intake manifold. It says we can check the number 1 cylinder intake valves, the number 3 cylinder exhaust valves, we can check the number 2 exhaust valves, and we could check the number 6 intake valves. So those are all the valves we're going to check on this first go around. And then the book explains the spec. The intake spec is 0.13 to 0.23 millimeters or 0.006 to 0.009 inches. The spec for the exhaust is 0.27 to 0.37 millimeters or 0.011 to 0.014 inches. All right, we're ready to get started on checking the valve lash. On this first go around, we're going to check the number 1 intake valves. There's 2 of them per cylinder, 2 intake and 2 exhaust. So we're going to get in here with our feeler gauge and check the lash here. And then the other one we can check on this first go around is the number 3 exhaust ones. The cylinders run from front to back on the passenger side. Number 1, number 3, and then number 5 at the back. The perfect spec we're looking for the intake valves is 0.007 or 7 thousandths. So he's going to get in here with a 0.007, and I'll show you what this thing looks like. It might not show in the video, but it'll show the number. This says 0.007, and he's going to slip it right in between this lobe and the top of the shim, which is right underneath. Okay, and that goes in. So we know it's at least a 0.007. So now he's going to graduate to a 0.008 and see if that will slide in.
No.
And it doesn't. And I'm going to copy my friend Jordan, who I helped with checking the valve lash on his engine, on his 4-cylinder in his 3rd generation 4Runner, and he uses the term go, no go. So the 0.007 7 thousandths went, but the 0.008 didn't. So the 8 is a no-go. So we're going to call that valve lash a 0.007. Now he's going to check the other intake valve.
Back to a number 7. Yep.
Okay, that goes. So now he's going to check the 8.
Nope.
Okay, and that's a no-go. So we can say for both of these are both at 7 thousandths or 0.007. So now we're going to check the number 3 exhaust. The target that we're looking for, if it's going to be perfect for Wei's engine, is a 0.013 or 13 thousandths.
No.
It doesn't go. So then we're going to drop down to 12 thousandths, 0.012.
No.
No. Can you check on both of them?
No.
Okay, no on both. Now we're dropping down to 11 thousandths, 0.011.
No. No.
Okay, things are looking kind of grim for Wei. 0.010, 10 thousandths.
No.
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 Okay. Go down to 9 thousandths.
Okay.
Okay, it's going in on that one?
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
Okay, we know the rear exhaust valve for the number 3 cylinder is 9 thousandths, and we'll record that value. We're still trying to find where it is for the front exhaust valve for this number 3 cylinder.
8. No.
The 8 doesn't go either. Okay, it's looking even worse.
I'm trying 6.
6? So you're skep 7.
No.
Okay, so it's not a 6 or 7. It's going to go down to 5 thousandths.
No.
Okay, we're going to go down to 4 thousandths.
No.
Nope. Okay, 3 thousandths. Okay, so we have to go to another set of feeler gauges that Wei has, and the next available size we have is a 2 thousandths. So we're going to stick a 2 in there.
Nope.
2 doesn't go. What's the next one that we have available?
1.5 thou.
Okay, it's 0.0015.
Yep.
So finally we know what the clearance is. So it's a 0.0015, and that's not ideal. So I wanted to talk to you about why valve clearances tighten up over time. The main reason is that valve is slamming into the valve seat that's in the head a bunch of times, thousands and thousands and thousands, or actually millions and millions and millions, or billions of billions, who knows. That engine's rotating really fast and those valves are slamming into the seat. Over time, that valve seat takes some wear, and even the head of the valve can take some wear. And because of that wear, the valve sinks deeper into the head. When the valve is able to sink into the head a little further, that clearance gets less in between the shim and the cam lobe. The way you correct that is you go in there and you take the old shim out, you take a measurement, and there's a calculation, and then you can put the right size shim in there so you get the clearance you want. So we're gonna have to go to a much thinner shim to get that valve clearance in the proper spec. The bad thing about having too tight of a spec is that when the valve closes, it's maybe not closing completely. And then when the engine is on its combustion stroke and the air fuel mixture is ignited and the piston is driven downward, if the exhaust or intake valve is partially open, some of those products of combustion are blown past that valve seat, and then you can end up burning up the valve seat or the valve itself. So that's why it's not great to have a really tight clearance, because the valve is not seating all the way. And the other reason is you could be losing compression. If the valve isn't completely closing, then you're going to be losing some compression through that open valve, and then you're going to get a misfire and your engine's not going to run as optimally if it was closing all the way. So we know now, without a doubt, that we have to do some adjustments to get Wei's engine back into spec so it runs better. We didn't do it before, but now we're going to do a compression check because we want to have some type of benchmark to see if what we do with the valve lash adjustment is going to improve Wei's compression numbers. So we're going to now cut to doing a compression check, and I learned from my buddy Nick that owns Yoda One Performance in Riverbank, California, you can actually do a compression check with the valve covers off. It's not going to cause any real problem. The one worry is you're still going to be ejecting fuel. So we're going to take out the EFI 15 amp fuse to stop any fuel coming out from that fuel line we have disconnected on this driver's side, and then we're going to check the compression numbers on Wei's engine. All right, so on the driver's side you have this fuse box here. Wei's going to lift it up. There's a little tab on this side. Get it out of the way. We decided we're not going to pull the EFI relay out. We're just going to pull this 15 amp fuse right here for the EFI. It goes in this spot right there, 3 up from the bottom. And then now what I'm going to have Wei do is turn over the engine and just make sure that this fuel line we disconnected from the back of the engine is not spewing out fuel, because we don't want a fire. The other thing to note is that you want everything out of the way, so the wiring harness, so we have to make sure nothing's in the way of the valve train to where something's going to get caught and we're going to damage something. So we have to do a little bit of house cleaning here. So here's what we got. We have some little bungees pulling the wiring harness away from the turning parts of the engine on both sides. You see on this one we have a little bungee pulling this part of the wiring harness over to this driver's side fuel rail, and we both double checked each other's work and we see that nothing is going to get caught up. We also, for this cover, put a couple of the upper bolts in so the cover isn't loose, so the turning components of what makes up all the timing components isn't going to be hitting this cover. So we think we're ready to go. I'm just going to have Wei bump the starter just to make sure that nothing crazy happens before we really start cranking it over. So I'm going to be taking a look at this fuel line here. He's got a little plastic plug in here, and we have to reconnect the battery. We have my compressor tester made by OTC into the #1 cylinder. So we're first just going to crank it over briefly, and I'm going to make sure nothing crazy is happening, mainly with fuel spewing out everywhere and causing a fire. So go and just bump it, Wei. That was just dust coming up. Do it again. I think we're okay. That's just a bunch of dust coming up. Okay, we're good. Okay, so Wei's going to turn it over and we're going to see what this #1 cylinder is at. Go ahead, Wei. So that's pretty darn good. That's about 197, 198. So that's the #1 cylinder. So here's the problem cylinder, number 3, that we just determined. So it's going to be interesting to see how this one turns out. Okay, you ready for the brutal truth, Wei? Okay, go ahead, Wei. Wow. Bad. Stop. You're at 85. Houston, we have a problem. This is not good. So it's surprising that Wei wasn't getting a misfire on this cylinder. This tells us that more than likely those exhaust valves aren't closing all the way, and that's the reason why we have low compression numbers for this #3 cylinder. We're going to go ahead and do the rest of them right now. We're not going to show it, and we're going to record those values and then share them with you when we're all done. We are done with the compression check, and Wei is going to go over the numbers with you.
So for the #1 cylinder, we got 195. For the #2, we got 85. For #3, we got 85. #4, 150. #5, 90. And #6, 180. So all over the board.
So we basically have 3 cylinders that seem okay from 150 to 195, and then 3 cylinders that are pretty darn low from like 85 to 90, right?
Yeah.
Now that we know, Wei's engine is in a little bit more trouble than Wei would have hoped based off the look of his worried face. So we're now going to rotate the engine and check the next set of valves. The factory service manual says you turn the engine over 240 degrees. When you turn the engine over 2/3 of a turn or 240 degrees, it says you can check the following valves: the number 3 intake valves, the number 5 exhaust valves, the number 2 intake valves, number 4 exhaust valves. So those are the next ones we're going to do. Now, how do you accurately turn over the engine exactly 2/3 of a turn? Well, it's going to be a little bit of guesswork. We're going to get on that crank bolt, and starting from top dead center for the number 1 cylinder on the compression stroke, we're going to take notice of how much we're turning the ratchet, and it's going to be a little bit of guesstimation, but it doesn't have to be an exact science. When we see that the lobes of the cams are away from the number 3 intake valves, number 5 exhaust valves, number 2 intake, and number 4 exhaust, we'll pretty much know that we have the engine in the position to check those valves. It doesn't have to be exact. You just don't want the lobe of the cam compressing the shim at all, because then you're not going to get an accurate reading for the valve clearance. All right, we're going to start turning over the engine, and we're going to be paying attention to the cams because it's going to be hard to determine a perfect 2/3 turn or 240 degrees. So on this round, I should be able to see on the passenger side that the lobes are going to be away from the number 3 intake and the number 5 exhaust. And then Wei, looking over on the driver's side, should be seeing that the cam lobes will be away from the number 2 intake and the number 4 exhaust. All right, Wei, so go and start turning over the motor. Took about 3 swipes. Okay, stop right there for a second. So I'm now seeing that the number 3 intake, the lobes aren't on there. And it looks like the number 5 exhaust right here, that the cam lobes aren't on there either. How are you looking over there, Wei, for the number 2 intake and number 4 exhaust?
They're away, but I feel like I can turn a little bit more.
Okay, he's gonna give it a little bit more of a turn. Number 3 intake, the lobe is clearly away. Number 5 exhaust, clearly away. So I'm good on this side. Wei, how are you doing?
The number 2 intake is pointing up, and then the number 4 exhaust is pointing almost up. So that's good.
Okay, so we're confident now that we could properly check the next set of valves. We checked all the exhaust valves and intake valves for that second step. Now we're on the 3rd revolution, and we again do 2/3 of a turn or 240 degrees. And when we get done turning the engine that amount, we can check the number 1 exhaust, number 5 intake, number 4 intake, and number 6 exhaust. Okay, Wei, go ahead and turn it over. So on my side, the number 1 exhaust cam lobes are facing pretty much up, and then the number 5 intakes are facing up. And then on Wei's side, the number 4 intake, the lobes are facing away, which is great. And then the number 6 exhaust right here, the lobes are facing up. So we're in the perfect position to check all these valves now. So here's our results, and we have to make a lot of adjustments. I'll go over them. Every one of them with the check mark needs to be adjusted. So on the passenger side for cylinders 1, 3, and 5, all of the exhaust valves are out of spec. These 2 right here were way out. Those need adjustment big time. For the driver's side of the motor, this one's way out of spec. That one's way out of spec. All of those are out of spec. And then on the intake side, we're a little bit closer, but still quite a few out of spec. This 6/1000ths one is technically in spec, but it's really close to the limit. So we're going to try to bring that closer to 7. All these in 7 are good. These ones that are at 5,000, 6,000, we're going to want to bring those to 7. We have this one right here that's at 8,000, and we're not too concerned with that one because it's on the higher range, and knowing that they usually tighten up, we're not going to worry about that one. So we're probably going to leave that one at 8. We now have to pull these shims out of all the ones that are out of spec and take a measurement and then do some calculations to figure out what shim we have to put back in there to bring it to the spec we want. We're going to demonstrate 2 ways to compress the bucket to where you can pull that shim out. The first way we're going to show you is with this tool made by the Schley company. It mimics the Toyota special service tool that you pretty much no longer could find unless you know somebody who's a Toyota master mechanic and he has one in his toolbox. The second way we're going to do it is we're going to use a technique that I learned from my buddy Nick that owns Yoda One Performance, and that's a 2-person operation. One person grabs a big flat blade screwdriver, compresses the bucket down. Your partner gets some shop air with a little air nozzle, blows underneath the shim, pops it up, and then with a magnet grabs it and pulls it out, and then the other guy can let go of the bucket with the screwdriver and you get it out. And from what Nick told me, that's his preferred method, to use the 2-person technique with the screwdriver, shop air with a little nozzle, and a magnet. So what we did is we got the number 1 cylinder exhaust valves with the cam lobes pointing straight up. When you're removing a shim, you want the lobe pointing right up away from the bucket, and that's what the factory service manual says is the position easiest for you to be able to get that shim out. So let's go over to the number 1 cylinder and take a look. So here's the number 1 cylinder, and you can see the lobes are facing straight up. We're going to want to pull the shim out this direction because that's where we have the most room. We don't have any room on the outside, so what we have to do is we have to get the bucket with a little opening facing out so we can then maybe utilize a little pick tool to get underneath the shim to pop it up and then grab it with a magnet. You can get your finger in here, and as long as it's not too slippery, you can move the bucket and turn it. Way is moving the bucket, so you see that little notch. You want that notch to where you can get at it so you can get a pick tool in there to lift up the bucket. So now we're going to show you the next step. Here's the 2 tools that Schley makes. It's this tool that you compress the bucket with, and then this little tool right here that you get in there once you have the bucket compressed to hold down just the bucket but not the actual shim, so you can keep the bucket compressed and then get the shim out. When you're using this tool, you want this side facing the cam lobe of the valve you're working on. You don't want the side that has the writing on it facing it. And I'll show you how to do that for the number 1 exhaust valves. So the first one I'm going to try is this number 1 rear exhaust valve. The non-writing side is facing the cam lobe. I grab onto it, I get it right up against it, and then I'm going to crank it to where it pushes down the bucket and the shim at the same time. Then I got to get this tool, the longer side, and get it underneath here and just capture the bucket and not the shim, and that's the hard part. So I think I got it just on the bucket, and then I'll release, and it looks like it's holding. Got to be careful. If you knock this, you'll lose your position. Now that that's in place, now we can grab a pick tool and try to work up this shim right at the part where there's a little gap in the bucket. We can get a pick tool in there and try to lift it up. So I have this one. I'm going to try to lift it up. See how I pop that up? Now I'm going to grab a magnet. I have this one. It's really malleable. I can bend it however I want, and I grab it and I can pull the shim out just like that. Here's the shim for this rear exhaust valve for the number 1 cylinder. We're going to have to do the front one too, so we'll go ahead and do that one right now also. I'm going to want to get the holding tool out of here, so I have to compress it. Oh, it just popped out. So that's good enough. It popped out. So now we're going to have to do the same with this one. I'm going to orient it now in a different direction because I want the non-writing side facing the lobe, so I have to turn the tool around. Okay, so now I'm going to turn it towards me, compress the bucket. I'm going to use my headlamp because I can't really see very well. And I'm going to come in from this back side and see if I can get it on the edge of the bucket, but missing the shim. I think I got it on the bucket here. I was able to slip it in right here. I was trying to slip it in here, but this doesn't work. You have to have it on the non-polished side, so I don't think you can get the holder tool on this front edge of the cam. It doesn't work. I'm gonna again get my pick tool in here and see if I can lift up on it. I switched to a straight pick, and let me see if I can lift this up. I reset this. Let me see if I can get it out now. We kept on failing trying to get this longer side in between the bucket and the cam on the inside here. So we used the opposite side, which is shorter, and we were able to get it in between the end of the cam and the bucket, held it in place, and we were able to pop it out with the pick tool and grab it with the magnet. So we have both of these out. So it looks like both sides of this holder tool you're going to utilize. I thought we only needed this side, but we actually need to use this side in certain circumstances depending on which valve you're working on. One alteration that I did to this tool that Jordan figured out is that this end of the tool, the longer side, it's not quite long enough to hold the bucket down far enough to where you can sneak the shim out. You can put this on the anvil of a bench vise and you can hammer it down. As it comes from Schley, it's 9.2 millimeters, and so I hammered this down to where it's a 0.5 millimeter larger to 9.7 millimeters, and that seems to be about the right amount of elongation of this end of the tool to where you can hold the bucket down far enough to sneak the shim out. Just know that when you get this tool, you might have to hammer it down a little bit to grow the length by a 0.5 millimeter. So since this is such a struggle, we're not going to waste a lot of video footage showing us struggling to get each shim out that we have to calculate how we're going to get the valve clearance back into spec. So we're going to continue working on getting all the shims out that we have to get out. And then we'll come back and show you the calculations we do to where we can order the right shims to get all of his valves back within spec. One other thing to note, when we were struggling on that #1 cylinder to get those valve shims out, I tried the technique with a big screwdriver. I couldn't push it down, so I'm not manly enough to do it. And so we're just gonna do all of them with the 2 special tools that Schley makes. If you're a really strong guy and you can lean over the motor and get enough leverage to push that down and do that coordinated thing with the air, more power to you. But I tried to push one of those buckets down and I just couldn't get the leverage I needed to push down because I'm standing up on a step stool and I just don't have the leverage to do it. So I give credit to Nick. He must be a hell of a lot stronger than me. All right, so we're gonna keep getting these shims out. We're back looking at the factory service manual, and I wanted to show you what it says about doing the calculations. T equals the thickness of the used shim, A is the measured valve clearance, N is the thickness of the new shim. Here's our formula. The thickness of the new shim is going to be equal to T, the thickness of the used shim, plus A, the measured valve clearance minus the target value of 13 thousandths. We're now going to use a micrometer and we're going to measure the thickness of the used shim and input that into our formula. So you take the shim, you put it in your micrometer, and you take the measurement. I wish I could show you the numbers we're seeing on these dials, but it's so small, we're really not going to be able to show it. And so you're just going to have to get your own micrometer, read the instructions, and learn how to take proper measurements with it. So we finished measuring the shims. Starting from cylinder 1, we have the front shim for the exhaust was 0.118. The rear one was 0.114. The front shim for cylinder number 3 was 0.109. The rear one 0.114. And then for cylinder 5, the front shim was 0.115. And the rear shim was 0.112. We're going to show you how to do the calculations for one of these. We'll do the calculation to get the right shim size to bring the front exhaust valve for the #1 cylinder back into spec. So I'm going to let Wei write this out.
So N equals thickness of the removed shim, which is 1185, and then you add the measured valve clearance, which is 0.010. Then you subtract the target lash that we need, which is 0.013.
So put that in parentheses because you got to get that value.
0.003. So 0.1185 subtract 3 thou, which is equal to 0.1155.
0.1155. So we have to get a shim that size to bring that number one cylinder front exhaust valve back in the spec that we want, which would be 0.013. So now we inputted that into our valve lash log. We need to get a shim that's 0.115 to bring it within the spec. And then once we get that shim in place sometime in the future, we're hopefully going to see that the new lash is pretty close to 0.013. That's the goal. So now we're going to do the calculations for the rest of these. So we have the makings of a total nightmare. We found out the hard way that when you take all the shims out in one area, like we did on all these exhaust ones, you get to a point where you're turning over the engine and then the lobe gets stuck on the bucket and then you can't turn it anymore. So we had to fight with pushing down with a big screwdriver and using the bucket holding tool, and we were able to finally get it to where we needed it. We first got a couple shims put in here and that was fine, but then we started getting stuck and we had to again use the screwdriver and the holding tool to get the buckets down enough to where we can turn the engine to where the cam lobes weren't getting stuck on the edge of the bucket. So here's what we're going to do now. We're going to remove this exhaust cam to make life easier. We're operating under the school of hard knocks. We probably should have just removed the exhaust cam before trying to fight getting all these shims out, because it would have made our life easier. So here's the technique that you have to do. There's 3 holes in this split gear on the exhaust cam, and one of them is going to be threaded. And I learned this from my buddy Nick, who owns Yoda One Performance, and the size bolt is a M6 with a 1.0 pitch, and it ends up that the valve cover bolts are that size. So Nick suggested I just use one of the valve cover bolts, which I did. Got this thing screwed in here to where now this split gear won't become unsprung when we disconnect the exhaust cam from the head, because that would be a bad thing. And how you get that thing resprung, I don't know, and I don't want to learn how to. It's important that you put this bolt in here before you remove the cam so that doesn't happen. Nick also suggested just put a couple match marks carrying over from one gear to the other. So now we know how to get this cam back in the right position when we're done adding all the new shims that we have to add, and then we're ready to get the cam back in place. That's going to be our match mark that we have to match up to where we can get the cam back in the right position. And then once we do, we can remove this bolt and then put the engine back together. So, okay, I'm done talking. So we're learning a lot on this job, and it's not exactly fun, but we're getting it done. It's not enough that you just have the bolt in there. The factory service manual says you want to tighten that thing to 49 inch-pounds. So we're not going to get a torque wrench out for this, but Wade's just going to use a 1/4 inch drive and a 10mm socket and cinch it up. Okay, he says that's good. The factory service manual says to loosen these uniformly in a few passes. You start off on the front of the cam as you're looking at it from the front of the engine, inside bolt, outside bolt. Then you go to the back, inside bolt, outside bolt. Then you go to the one in the middle, closest to the front, inside bolt, outside bolt. And then number 7 and 8 are the ones in the center, closer to the rear, inside bolt, outside bolt. So Wade's gonna do that with a ratchet and 10mm socket and just do a few turns and just keep on doing that until we get them all loose. You don't want to loosen it all in one shot. It just says several passes. How much is several? I guess we're going to go for at least 3, but maybe more. So he's going to do the front one first, a little bit. Okay, that's enough. Just crack it. Okay, that's good. And then go to the back one. That's good. Okay, that one next, yep. That's good. Okay, that's good. And then that one. Okay, and then now we're gonna do another pass. So starting at the number 1, little turn, little turn, little turn, little turn, and then there, 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 okay. Okay, that's 2 passes. Let's see what we do on the 3rd one here. Maybe do a little more of a turn. No, I wouldn't go crazy.
That's 1 revolution.
1 revolution, okay. Okay, one revolution.
These are loose already.
See, that one has a little tension on it still. Okay, they seem to be all loose. See how there's a little tension again? So it's slowly lifting up. Okay, you get the idea. We're going to keep on doing passes and slowly bringing these bolts out. There's no more tension on the bolts. So now we're removing the bolts all the way and removing the collars. We're thinking that we want to keep track of where these collars go. So that's their front one. So Wade just noticed that these are marked E1, E2, and E3 from front to rear. So maybe exhaust 1, collar, exhaust 2, exhaust 3. Okay, we got them all lined up. Now, what's it like pulling a cam out? We've never done it. So I guess you just lift it out. Okay, we are learning all kinds of things. So when we tried to remove the camshaft by not following the factory service manual's suggestions, it didn't work. I think it was because that these lobes were pushed onto the shim and bucket and there was tension. So what you have to do, and getting a little lighted mirror is really helpful. You can look on the back side of the cam and you can see the 2 dots on each gear lining up with each other. And then if the video is going to show it, there's also a paint mark that the factory put on the teeth to align the gear. So we've got the 2 dots on one gear lined up with the 2 dots on the other gear. And then now this camshaft will come out. So we made a new mark with white paint as opposed to the red paint. So we're going to disregard the red match marks and we're going to use the white ones instead. So now you could simply just pull this out. At least I thought. Right there. There it is. Finally. If you want a good shot, hopefully you could see this. There's 2 little dots right here. These are the alignment dots that you have to align with the other gear on the intake camshaft. They're kind of small, but you can see them once you get your head in there. So now on to the next step. It looks like on the driver's side, there's a single dot that aligns the 2 camshaft gears. So we've got those lined up. We got the M6 by 1.0 pitch bolt tightened up to marry the split gear. And then now we're gonna go through the sequence of removing all these camshaft collars, and we're gonna remove this exhaust cam because we have to do adjustments to all these too. So it's just much easier to go ahead and remove the whole camshaft instead of messing around with those Schley tools to hold each bucket down. It's just a pain in the butt. We've got the driver's side exhaust cam out, and now you can see all the shims on top of their buckets, and it's going to be a lot easier to get them out now. So I want to get this really clear so nobody using this tutorial is going to get confused. So if you're going to follow our lead and remove the exhaust camshafts for this job because you found a lot of them were out of spec, on the passenger side or right hand side, the way the book calls it, you line up the 2 dots on each gear, and then you could easily pull that exhaust camshaft out of the engine. When you're doing the driver's side or left hand side, like the manual calls it, you're lining up the single dots on each camshaft gear. That's the right orientation to remove the driver's side one, because on each gear there's a single dot and there's 2 dots. So you got to remember that. Driver's side, line up the single dots. Passenger side, line up the 2 dot marks. I hope that's as clear as mud. We're using a magnet on this driver's side to try to help pull the shims out, and we noticed that the bucket just can come straight out, and we found out that you could just slide that right back onto the valve spring and it's not a big deal. Just got to carefully line it up. There we go. And it just slides back in. So don't be alarmed if the bucket comes up and it slides off the valve spring. No big deal. You could slide it back in. Before we get to the end of the video and I share all my thoughts on what made this job a little bit difficult for Wei and I want to talk about those things right now in case some of you don't watch the whole video. One of our main hangups is the fact that, number one, we had a lot of valves we had to adjust. So we were thinking when we were on that passenger side and we were taking all those exhaust shims out, we didn't know that it would be an issue leaving those shims out while continuing to rotate the engine to get other shims out. And what ends up happening is that once one of the lobes pushes on the bucket and goes into the valley where the shim lives, when it tries to go up the other side of the bucket, it gets stuck. And then you're in a situation where if you're by yourself, you kind of screwed yourself, because what Wei and I ended up doing to fix that problem so we could continue to turn over the engine is I pushed down on the bucket with the screwdriver and was able to sneak the lobe past the edge of the bucket. The problem is though, if you have both exhaust or both intake on one cylinder out, you could easily compress one bucket, but the other lobe is going to hit. So then you'd have to push down two screwdrivers at the same time while your buddy gets onto the crank bolt and turns the crank bolt to get the lobe to go past both edges of both buckets. And it becomes a pain in the butt to do that with two screwdrivers, a lot of force pushing down those buckets. So here's what I suggest. When you're doing this job and you know you have a lot of exhaust valves out of spec, go ahead and follow our instructions and just remove those exhaust cams, because it's pretty darn easy from what you saw. It's not that involved. If you find that you have a bunch of intake valves out of spec, then the process to get those intake cams out is a lot more involved, because you have to tear apart the front of the motor to get the intake cam pulleys off, and then you can remove all the collars and get the intake camshafts out. So it's going to be more work because you got to tear apart the front of the motor to get those intake camshafts out. And so we didn't really want to do that. Like I said, if you have a lot of exhaust valves out of spec, just pull the exhaust camshafts out. It makes life much easier to get the shims out and to get the new ones back in that are going to get you back into spec. For the intake valves, hopefully you're not going to have too many out of spec. If you have both intake valves for one cylinder out of spec, what I suggest is you take the shims out, you take a measurement, and you put at least one back in. So then when you're turning over the motor and your buddy's helping you, you just have to worry about pushing one bucket down with a screwdriver to get the cam to clear the bucket, and then you could go on to the next valves that you have to pull the shims out and make measurements. So to reiterate, if you have two valves next to each other that are both out of spec, both intake or both exhaust, I suggest you take the measurements but put at least one back in. If you're by yourself, then you're kind of stuck and you're going to have to put both of them back in, because you can't be in two places at one time. It's going to be hard for you to be turning over the motor and pushing down on that bucket with a screwdriver at the same time. It's going to be a real chore for you. In a perfect world, you would have a nice complete shim kit. So you take a measurement, you find out it's out of spec, you compress the bucket and shim with your special tool, you use the holder tool to hold the bucket down, you get the shim out, take your measurement, you look in your nice little full complete kit of shims and you put the right one back in, and then you're done with that one. Most people aren't going to have a huge supply of shims of all different sizes. Only a shop is going to have that, and most do-it-yourselfers aren't going to buy all those shims. They're about $18 a piece from Toyota. That's the reason why Wei and I did it the way we did it. We didn't want to go through the pains of removing them, taking a measurement and putting them back in, because it's such a pain in the butt to get them out in the first place. It's a serious test of patience. So those are all my suggestions, and I hope they make sense. So let me show you what I'm talking about. The problem with the shim removed out of the bucket and you're turning over the motor to get to the next set of valves you want to deal with. Say for instance, this cam was going to be moving downward, and as soon as the lobe comes down, it's going to compress the edge of the bucket, but then it's going to get into the area where the shim is, and it's going to continue to turn till it gets up to the lip on the other side, and it's going to get stuck. So what you have to do is you have to get onto the edge of the bucket with a big screwdriver, push it down while your friend is turning the engine over, and then it could clear the edge of the bucket, and then you can continue the turning process and get the camshaft in the next correct position so you can get some other shims out and take some measurements. So this is what I'm talking about. This cam lobe gets stuck right on the edge of the bucket. This was a situation that we didn't expect. We didn't expect 16 valves out of spec. I was thinking maybe 1 or 2, and it was gonna be a short and sweet, easy video, but maybe it's good that this happened because you're seeing a lot more than I thought we were gonna show, like removing the exhaust cams out of the engine and that sort of thing. So I think maybe because of that, the video is gonna have a lot more value for you, the viewer. We're going to show you how to get one of the shims back in. We're going to show you on one of the most difficult ones. This is the number 5 cylinder rear valve. Like I said earlier, in a perfect world, you had a big supply of shims and you compressed the bucket down, you held it down with a tool, you took the shim out, measured it, and you plopped the new one back in. But we didn't do that. We took the shims out, removed the holder tool, and took our measurements, and then we mixed and matched a bunch of the shims that we pulled out of the engine to be able to get a lot of the shims we needed just from mixing and matching from the engine, which worked out for us. We only had to buy 3 shims. But now, here's the problem with the shim removed and the bucket not compressed. When you try to use the special service tool that compresses the shim and the bucket down to where you can get the holder tool in, that tool is pretty much relying on the shim being in there so it could rotate against the shim. Now that the shim's out, the only thing you could rotate against is the very edge of the bucket, which makes it hard to get the bucket down and then get a shim in at the same time. What we're going to do is we're going to use a flat blade screwdriver. I'm going to come over the top of the cam. I'm going to push down the bucket while Way slides in the new shim. If you were by yourself and you were in the same predicament, then I would suggest you push down the bucket with a screwdriver, get the holder tool on the edge of the bucket holding it down, and then you can slide the shim in all by yourself without somebody helping you. So we're going to give this a shot. I'm going to push down the bucket and Way's going to come in on this side and slide it in place. You'll notice that we have a rag here. There are some spots on the head where those shims could fall into, and then it's a little bit of a hard chore to get them out with a magnet. So we suggest you pay attention to those, and one of them is right down in here, and then there's another one off to the right here. So you don't want to drop these shims into those valleys, so blocking it with a rag is a pretty smart move. I'm going to lean over and I'm going to push down the bucket. Okay, it's down. Okay, it's partially in there. I have to just now get on the edge of the bucket and not be impeding in the spot where the shim needs to slide into. So I just got to get right on the edge of the bucket. We got it in. It was a little bit hard because you really got to get the screwdriver just on the bucket to where it doesn't impede where the shim needs to drop in. So we don't know which is easier, pushing down the bucket and trying to get the little holder tool in there on the edge, or just doing it the way we did it. It wasn't that bad. I had to compress it just a few times to where finally Way can slide the shim into the bucket, and we're done getting this one in. And then obviously the other way you do it is you just kept the holder tool in position and you got the right shim in there after you measured it. You figured out what you needed, you did your calculations, figured out what shim needs to go back in there to get you back in the spec, and then you slide it back in. So you're not doing double duty. And to reiterate, the reason why we did double duty is because we didn't have shims on hand. So we had to mix and match the shims we had available from this engine and from some other shims that Way got from vehicles that are pick and pull, and finally the 3 we had to buy that we didn't have. So I know I'm beating a dead horse, but I wanted to reiterate that. Okay, I wanted to share with you that the suggestion that Nick said about pushing down the bucket with the screwdriver and then using the shop air, it does work. But what I'm finding is when you're leaning over the engine from like a step stool, you really can't get quite enough leverage. So I'm literally on top of the motor, and when you push down on the bucket from this position, you can get a lot more force, and then your buddy can come in here with a shop air and a magnet and grab it. This is a way you can do it, but I really think you got to get on top of the motor to do it, to get enough leverage to push that bucket down, because leaning over the engine from a step stool seems to be kind of harder to do. So if you want to ride the top of the engine and use that screwdriver and air chuck technique with the magnet, then I think it is a viable option for you. we got all the intake shims in. Now we're gonna get our exhaust camshafts in. And here's what the factory service manual says. You want the alignment dots facing 90 degrees, so basically pointing either towards the driver's side or the passenger side. We're going to get the passenger side in, so you want to turn over the engine utilizing the 19mm crank bolt, and I'm going to be watching while Wei is turning over the motor, and I want to see that the double dots are going to be pointing basically towards the passenger side, and then I'm going to tell him to stop, and then we should be able to drop in the exhaust camshaft. So here's the directions right here. Place the intake camshaft at 90-degree angle of timing marks, 2 dot marks on the cylinder head. All right, I'm utilizing my mirror, and I'm also looking for that white mark that we put on the cam. Those are 2 visual indicators letting me know that I'm gonna get in the right position. So go ahead, Wei. Coming around, coming around. Starting to see the white mark. Keep coming. Okay, right about there. I think that's about right. I see the 2 dot marks, and it's also designated with some yellow paint from the factory. So I think we have the intake camshaft in the right position to now drop in the exhaust camshaft. Here's the steps that the factory service manual says to now get the exhaust camshaft on the right-hand side or passenger side. You apply new engine oil to the thrust portion and journals of the camshaft. I'm taking that to mean any part of the camshaft that moves on another surface, we're gonna coat that with some fresh engine oil. And then you place the camshaft into the head. So we're gonna lubricate this passenger side camshaft really well with motor oil on all the moving surfaces. All right, we have the exhaust cam and a little tray, and this would be nice if you had a little like squirt oil gun. Mainly these, like these right there, but yeah, the cams too. We're just gonna massage this.
It's like a turkey.
Yeah, getting oil on all the moving surfaces.
Okay.
Right here too, get this one too. That moves in there too, in that journal. Now we walk back over to the engine, and he's got to find those marks, so where the 2 dot marks are, and we got that white paint mark that we could line up too. Should be able to slide it in there, lining up those marks. Nope, you're off. You have to come in at an angle and get the tooth lined up right there. It's not dropped in the back. You're hung up right there. Okay, so the white paint marks I could see are lined up, but I'm gonna do one more double check. I'm gonna look on the back side with my little telescoping mirror and double check that. Crank it over just a little bit the other way. We didn't have the intake camshaft in the proper position to get our match marks lined up. We were just a little off. Stop right there.
Right there.
I could definitely see on the back side the 2 dot marks on each gear are lined up, and we have our double check of our own match marks we made on the front side. So we're confident we got this exhaust cam in the right position, married up with the intake cam. Now what we have to do is we have to get all these collars put back in, and I'm going to share some information regarding that from the factory service manual. I can't remember if we said it, but each one of these collars is numbered and it has an arrow. So starting from the back towards the front, it's E4, E3, E2, and E1 for exhaust collar number 4 through 1. And all the arrows should be pointing towards the front of the engine or the front of the vehicle. That's what we're going to make sure we do, and we're going to put engine oil on all of those collars too, just to make sure we got a nice lubrication of the collars too before we put them in place. Another thing we're going to do is the factory service manual says to apply a light coat of engine oil on the threads of the bolts and under the heads too. You basically want to lubricate the entire bolt for the most part, other than the very top of the head. So we're going to make sure we lubricate all the bolts before we install them into the exhaust cam collars, rather into the bearing caps. Hopefully that's going to show up, but that says E4, and it has a little arrow, and we want that arrow pointing towards the front of the motor. We're going to lubricate all these surfaces of the bearing caps to make sure they're nice and lubricated, so when the engine turns over those first revolutions, there's not going to be any excessive wear. That's the reason why the factory service manual says to put some fresh motor oil, so you don't get excessive wear on the first turning of the camshafts. Lubricate under the heads of the bolts too.
Like under here?
Yeah, under the head of the bolt, yeah. That's what it said.
That's
I think
what I'm
they
saying.
probably set the torque spec with the bolts lubricated as opposed to dry. Okay, so you get the idea. Just make sure you follow our instructions and get them on the correct way with the arrows towards the front of the engine from back to front. 4, 3, 2, 1. Way has all the bearing caps on, and then now it says to uniformly tighten the 8 bearing cap bolts in several passes, basically similar to getting them off. You do it gradually. Now the sequence is different. You start on the second to the last bearing cap, and you do the outside bolt and inside bolt, and then you go to the other center one, 3 and 4, outside, inside. Then you jump back to the furthest one in the back, 5 and 6, outside, inside, and then you jump back to the very front, 7 and 8, outside, inside. So that's the sequence we're gonna do, doing several passes, bringing these bolts up to spec. And the spec is 12 foot-pounds. Way has all the bolts started, but now what he's simply going to do with an extension and a 10mm socket, he's just going to screw them down to where they touch down and no further. Now that all the bolts are touched down, here's the tightening procedure that I went over with you in the factory service manual. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And we're going to keep on doing those passes. So just a little bit of a turn each one. You don't want to do too crazy. He's just using my little shorty 3/8 ratchet right now. Just a little bit of a turn each one. Go to the back. Those feeling pretty tight, Way?
Yeah.
Okay, so now that one's a little loose.
This one wasn't tight all the way down.
Okay, so now that they're feeling a little bit tight, let's transition to the torque wrench, and we're going to set that to 12 foot-pounds. We're choosing to use my inch-pound torque wrench, so when you use an inch-pound torque wrench, you just multiply the foot-pounds by 12. So we have the inch-pound torque wrench set to 144. A little bit of a turn each one. Just take it gradual. Back one first. It goes back first.
Doing about 40 degrees. Oh,
okay, that hit. That hit.
That hit. That hit. That hit. That hit.
Okay, last one. Okay.
Go back really quick.
He's just gonna double check. All right, we now have the exhaust camshaft properly installed with the engine with all the bearing caps torqued to 12 foot-pounds or 144 inch-pounds. One thing we want to make sure that we don't forget, and part of the reason why we used a valve cover bolt instead of another bolt, is you don't want to forget to take out this holding bolt that holds the main gear with the sub gear together on this exhaust camshaft. So we have to remove that now, and that's a 10mm bolt. The steps to get the driver's side or left hand exhaust cam are going to be the same thing. You're going to want to have the single dot mark on that gear on the intake camshaft facing the driver's side fender at a 90 degrees, somewhere in there. You just eyeball it and hopefully you got it perfectly right the first time. With the bearing caps for the exhaust camshaft on the driver's side, now the arrows are going to be facing back towards the firewall. So it starts with exhaust 4, 3, 2, and 1. So that's the proper order of the bearing caps for the driver's side, and all the arrows facing towards the firewall or the back of the engine. The main difference is with the driver's side is now you're just aligning the single dot marks on each gear rather than the double dot marks. That's all you need to do. We're not going to show the process, so we're going to get this exhaust cam in and all the bearing caps inserted and torqued to spec. After we got both exhaust camshafts back in, we got in there with our feeler gauges to recheck the valve lash and make sure we got the numbers we were hoping for. And what we found is it didn't work out. And we think it didn't work out for a few reasons. Number one, you're removing that camshaft out of the head, and for whatever reason, if it doesn't seat all the way perfectly back into the journals that it sits in, and it doesn't end up in the exact same position, that's going to throw off your valve lash numbers. The other theory is when we did that compression test with the valve covers off, Way's engine had a bunch of dust fly up. And so dust got all over the camshafts and the buckets and the shims, and that ended up not being the greatest idea. Knowing that Way's engine was kind of dusty, we probably should have put the valve covers back on kind of loosely without any of the bolts even in, just covering that area to keep that area clean so no dust particles got all over those components. Another thing we were thinking that might have made a difference is the fact that when we took the exhaust cams out and we were pulling the shims out and the buckets were coming off, we were placing the buckets back onto the valve springs with our hands. And then there's maybe a chance that when you placed it back onto the valve spring, it wasn't completely fully seated, like maybe off a couple thousandths. What we wish we would have done is turn the motor over by hand a few times to get the cam lobes hitting the shims and bucket, pushing the valve springs down, and then hopefully getting everything seated fully, because we think that maybe the buckets weren't fully seated. So now I'm going to turn it over to Wade, and I'm going to let him describe the nightmare he had trying to get everything into the spec after getting the exhaust cams on, because we gave up. After we saw that the numbers weren't working out, we went and got some food and some beers and just kind of relaxed because it was a frustrating day. So I'm going to turn it over to Wade and let him explain the problems he had getting everything back together.
So one of the biggest issues I had was that once I put the camshafts back in, I put the feeler gauges in, and the numbers of the lashing was different than what I was expecting after my calculations. So I would take the camshafts back out, put the new shims in, and that should have solved the issue. Well, once I did it, I put it back in, I put the feeler gauges, and it still wasn't giving me the right answer. In fact, sometimes it was giving me that answer that told me that I should have had my old shims back in. Even though everything I was doing was correct by the book, it didn't work out in practice. And the biggest thing that I took away was that because of either dust or just little things that might have changed the way that I was putting it in, it caused the measurements to be off. After a while, I realized that if I could get it close, and I was able to get it in at 14 thou, even though the target was 13. But if you look at the book, there's a range, and I think that's why there is a range, because you can go crazy trying to get that perfect number. But once I was able to get it close, I was happy with it and realized that I just had to call it a day.
So like Wei said, it can be frustrating and the numbers change on you. And like I said, for the reasons I think potentially we were getting those different numbers, what I suggest you do is, number one, make sure your environment is really clean. So if you decide to pull those exhaust cams out, wipe them down really good with a microfiber towel that's not going to leave any residue of like little threads. And when you oil it in a pan that's perfectly clean, and get it back in there. And when you get back in there on the heads, make sure that everywhere the camshaft is going to be sitting is perfectly clean. No grit got in there. And this way you're going to have a better chance of getting the numbers you were looking for on the first try, getting the exhaust cams back in. And then, like I said, I suggest you turn the motor over a couple times, having the cam lobes hit those buckets at least a couple times, to where if you remove the bucket and you put it back in by hand, maybe it's going to fully seat, and then you're going to get the numbers you were looking for with those feeler gauges after you get it all put back together. I talked to Nick at Yoda One about our experience, and he told me that this job is very frustrating for that reason. Sometimes you don't get the numbers you were looking for when you do the calculations and you get the new shim back in. It doesn't work out. He told me that there's lots of shops that pass on this job because they hate it. They don't like doing it, and they say, no thank you, we don't want your money. You know, go down to another shop that's willing to do this really tedious and frustrating job. We're telling you all this because we want you to have the best chance of success. So hopefully you're going to have a better experience than Wei and I did, because this was probably in the top 3 of my most frustrating jobs I've ever done on a Toyota 4Runner. I mean, it was just a really frustrating process. So now that we have the valve lashes at the spec that we want, we're going to redo the compression test. Wei warmed up his engine to operating temperature, And what we're going to be hoping to see is that all of these numbers on all 6 cylinders are back at the optimum level, or as optimum as we can get with an engine that has 250,000 miles. It's not going to be perfect, but we're hoping we're not going to see a couple cylinders at 85 and one cylinder at 90 and another one at 150. If you remember, our numbers were like 195, 180, 150, 85, 85, and 90. So we're hoping at the very least those 3 really low ones come up a lot. And we're also hoping that that 151 comes up higher to about the 180 range. So we're going to do the compression check again, and then we're going to report back the numbers we got. All right, we have some good numbers to report for Wei's engine. But before we get to the numbers, let me tell you what the factory service manual says what you're looking for when it comes to compression numbers on this V6 5VZ-FE engine. You're looking for compression numbers 174 PSI or higher. They say the minimum pressure is 145 PSI, and you're looking for no more than a 15 PSI difference between all 6 cylinders. So now I'm going to turn it over to Wei, and I'm going to let him describe the numbers we just got on his engine. Now you have to realize that we did the original compression test when the engine was really cold, and you're going to get a little bit different numbers because of that, because you should be doing a compression test with the engine at operating temperature, but the numbers we got are dramatically different in the good range, and so I'll let Wei go over the numbers now.
I'm happy to report these numbers. Much different than I thought they were going to turn out. But so the number 1 cylinder before was 195, after it's 220. Number 2 was 85, now it's 220. Number 3 was 85, now it's 210. Number 4 was 150, now it's 215. Number 5, 90, now it's 208. And number 6 was 180, now it's 210. So everything is between 205 to 220.
So it would appear this valve adjustment we did on Wei's engine was a rousing success. His engine was in quite a bit of trouble, and we brought 3 cylinders back from the dead, from 85, 85, and 90 to the 210 range, which is freaking awesome. The one thing that we know about Wei's engine is that a couple of those exhaust valves needed the skinniest shim to get it back into spec. So what that means is that if another valve adjustment is needed on Wei's engine, there's nowhere to go because they don't make a thinner shim. So that's going to be time to pull the heads and get the heads reworked, or just replace them with remanufactured heads. But for now, we bought Wei's engine a lot more life, and he's pretty happy. And I'm happy that we got a good result. Now I'd like to go over some of the specialty tools we use. First, I'm going to go over the special service tools that you use to compress the bucket and shim and hold the bucket down with the tools. I actually found a seller that sells the OEM Toyota tools. So you'll remember what the Schley tools look like. These look a lot different. This bucket holding tool is much more precision. It looks like it's laser cut, and the edges are all really sharp, and it's going to be much better to get it onto the edge of the bucket and hold it down. When it comes to this tool has a much narrower profile, and I'll hold up the Schley tool against it so you can see the comparison. Another cool thing is it has set screws, and so it's meant to where you can take these shafts out and you could put them in on the side. So if you were in a situation where you didn't have enough room to turn the tool with the arms in this fashion, you can loosen the set screws and put them in from the side, and then you're working the tool like this. So it's pretty darn nice. Let me hold up the Schley tool to this one. You'll see how much more narrow this one is, and because it's more narrow, it's going to allow you more room to get the bucket tool in. So look at this comparison. Look how much wider this tool is compared to this one. It's just way, way thinner. And so it's going to give you more room to work with. The part number for both of those tools is this part number right here. If you wanted to buy the tools individually, the bucket holding tool is this part number right here. If you want to buy this tool separately, the part number is 09248054010. I got both of these tools from a company called Freedom Racing Tool and Auto. They're a little pricey. I think it was like 175 bucks, but then when you add tax and shipping, it was a little over $200. But I really think those OEM special service tools are gonna make the job easier. So if you have the money and you like buying tools, maybe you go ahead and buy the OEM tools. I'm pretty sure that the company OTC that used to make a lot of the special service tools for Toyota is still making this. It's either that or Freedom Racing had some old stock on hand and I was able to get those tools from their old stock supply of OEM SST tools. When it comes to using shop air with a magnet, I got this nice little shop air nozzle from Harbor Freight. It doesn't come with the nipple. You have to buy the connection separate, put it on with a little Teflon tape. But this is a nice fine tip that's angled that you can get in there and blow air under the shim. This was the magnet tool that I was using. As you can see, it's got malleable arm here to where you could bend it to the position you need it to get it in there. So I liked using this one to be able to get in there to grab the shim once you either lift it up with a pick tool or you blow it with shop air. These little telescoping ones work pretty well, but I think this one works a little bit better because you can bend it to the shape you need to get in there. When it comes to measuring the shims, you really need a micrometer for accurate measurements. Don't try to use something like this, a digital caliper. They're fairly precise, but they're not going to be as precise as a micrometer. So I do not suggest you cheaping out and trying to use a digital caliper like this because it's not going to be as accurate. All these tools, especially the specialty ones, I'm going to link in the video description so you can buy them if you're going to be doing a valve adjustment on your Toyota engine. Here's a couple suggestions I think will help you in preparing for this job. Number one, remember Way went to a pick and pull and he harvested a bunch of shims from other vehicles. He got some from Camrys, from Avalons, and from Siennas at local pick and pulls in his area in Alameda. And that helped him have a multitude of different size shims for this job. Another idea that I thought of is that Toyota dealerships usually have a refund policy. So if you don't use the part, you can take it back. So here's what I'm thinking. You buy ahead of time a lot of the smaller size shims, like from the size 1, which is the smallest size, to about the size 8 or size 9, and get maybe a couple of them. And they're gonna cost you a lot of money. Full price is like $18 a piece, but you know that you're only gonna be paying for the ones you use, and then the other ones you don't use, you could take back to Toyota and get your money back. And the whole purpose of buying those shims and then getting some other ones from wrecked vehicles at a pick and pull is you have them all right there with you while you're doing the job, so you don't have to repeat the work. So you can get the bucket down with a special tool, you can get the bucket holding tool in place, and then you can take that old shim out, you can measure it, do your calculations with the formula that the factory service manual shows you, and then you can figure out the shim you need, and hopefully from the ones you bought and the ones you harvested from a pick and pull, you'll have the right shim. So you can then just plop the new shim in, and you don't find yourself in a situation we were where we had to compress the bucket and mess with the bucket and the shim more than one time. So that's what I'm suggesting you do. Get a bunch of shims in your possession when you're ready to do this job, and hopefully you don't have to order any and have your truck down for a couple days while you're ordering them. And then it also lessens your workload because now you're not having to push that bucket down and painfully get that little bucket holding tool in place multiple times. You just have to do it once and you're done. Here's a page right out of the factory service manual, and it shows you all the size shims you can buy. There's 17 of them. If you followed our suggestion and you got some from pick and pull, then you could cross off the ones you have, and then maybe you go to Toyota and you buy the ones you don't have, so you have them ready to go if you need them for your job. The last thing that I wanted to share with you, the form that we use to record all our values, where we recorded the compression numbers and the valve lash and our calculations, everything, we're gonna have a Google Doc that we're gonna share with you in the video description. I'll provide a link there, and so you can then print that form out and you can have that form to use for your valve clearance check on your vehicle. Also on that form, we're going to provide a list of vehicles that have the same shim as this 3.4 liter V6, and then you could use that information when you go to a pick and pull and look for all those different vehicles, and then hopefully the engine's there and you could lift up the camshafts and you can harvest a bunch of shims that you can use. So I wanted to let you know that also. All right, now I'm done talking. Those are all the suggestions I have for you. We thank you for watching Toyota Time with Timmy the Toolman and Sean and special guest Wei. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing. If you have any questions or comments, do that below. Take care. Bye-bye. Sick mods and happy wrenching, people. Peace out. Bye-bye.